Thank you for joining our webinar. Today, we will talk about a new workflow for supercritical fluid chromatography, SFC, which uses the data from column screening to directly create isocratic or focused gradient methods, and we will compare it to existing SFC method development techniques. We will discuss some definitions and explore why we use SFC and why Teledyne ISCO SFC. We will discuss the steps for method development, starting with scouting gradients and column screens, and then how to create focused or isocratic gradient methods from those scouting runs. We will introduce a new method for determining these gradients from scouting runs that is faster and more accurate than existing techniques, using examples from chiral chromatography, and explore achiral compounds such as peptides and natural products. This page compares SFC to regular liquid chromatography. SFC has different terminology because it was once considered an offshoot of gas chromatography. The terminology survives even though SFC is now considered to be normal phase chromatography. Carbon dioxide is the weak solvent held at a temperature and pressure to make it supercritical. The co-solvent is the strong solvent. We often refer to the strong solvent as the B solvent. In regular liquid chromatography, we often use solvent modifiers such as trifluoroacetic acid, triethylamine, or buffers. In SFC, those are called modifier or an additive. As mentioned earlier, SFC is normal phase chromatography. It is orthogonal to reverse phase chromatography. SFC will have different selectivity. This means that compounds that co-elute in reverse phase may be resolved on SFC. There is a wide choice of columns, and SFC runs faster, as will be seen in the runs we will present later. As there is little to no water, SFC allows faster dry down of samples. SFC reuses carbon dioxide from other processes. There is greatly reduced need for chlorinated solvents because of the pi bonds in carbon dioxide. SFC uses carbon dioxide, which is relatively benign unless you get a huge gas leak. So you work in a ventilated area. We have 3 slides before we get to the science. The AccuPrep SFC is a new offering. It is based on PeakTrack software. So if you can run a flash chromatography system, you can run the AccuPrep SFC. The AccuPrep SFC works well for both chiral and achiral compounds. The PeakTrack software supports workflows involving stacked injections, sample overlays, repeated injections, and even single samples. A user can choose between 4 solvents and 6 columns for rapid column screening and fast runs once the method is optimized. The AccuPrep SFC doesn't need much space compared to other SFC systems as indicated by the colored boxes. PeakTrack runs on the system, so no extra PC is needed, and the system can be networked so it can be run and monitored remotely. The workflow we will describe starts with column and solvent screening. There are a series of scouting runs which may be run on an analytical SFC or run on the AccuPrep SFC. These can be automatically run in a sample queue. At the end of the runs, we choose the best chromatogram. We can then determine a method from the best scouting run, test it, and run the method to purify compounds, and then optimize the purification with stacked injections. Although SFC is commonly used for chiral purification, it works well for achiral purifications as well. Small molecules can be rapidly purified, including those found in natural products, and larger molecules such as peptides work very well too. SFC works with a wide polarity range greater than LC, which means there is a greater ability to purify compounds. Carbon dioxide is nonpolar like hexane and works very well to replace chlorinated compounds. There is a wide choice of SFC compounds for chiral purifications. Most users find they only need a few of these columns. There is a wide choice for chiral columns too, which will be discussed during our next webinar, which will also give hints for choosing columns based on the functional groups on a compound. There is no C18 of FFC. However, we will discuss column and solvent screening, which will help you choose a method very quickly. Column and solvent screening are commonly run on an analytical system, but those same scouting gradients can be run on the AccuPrep SFC as well, since it holds 6 columns and can switch between 4 solvents, and the samples can be loaded in a queue and run automatically in a sequence. It can run gradients up to 70% co-solvent, extending the range of SFC over other SFC systems. By using the same column for scouting and purification, the column is a perfect match between the scouting and prep run. As SFC is normal phase, more polar solvents make compounds elute faster, and less polar compounds cause later elution, and you can change solvents to change the retention time on a column. Likewise, silica columns can hold compounds more strongly than diol, for example, and our next webinar will describe this in more detail. In general, use an acidic modifier for acidic compounds and a basic modifier for basic compounds. The general idea is to make the compound being purified less polar so it elutes easier. The modifier may improve the peak shape and may allow improved or faster elution. A scouting gradient helps to determine if a compound will elute. Fronting or tailing peaks suggest the need for a different column or the use of an additive. Scouting gradients tend to make peaks sharper than isocratic methods, so a fronting or tailing peak during a scouting gradient will show a worse peak during a preparative run. In this case, a gradient was focused on the second peak. Note that it is tailing, showing peak asymmetry in a very fast gradient where it should be very symmetric. The focused gradient did work, but the compound eluted as a wide peak and looked like it had 2 peaks actually. Here's an example of column screening. Thalidomide was run on 3 different chiral columns made by PerkinElmer. The same gradient was used, and there are differences in resolution between the different compounds. The CCA column in the lower right gave the best resolution and will be chosen for the preparative run. The same sample was used for all 3 runs with the same injection volume. Notice the CCO column peaks are wider than the CCA column, which suggests the prep run will be better on. There are several ways to go from a scouting run to a preparative method. Very experienced chromatographers can make a good guess for a gradient solvent composition by inspecting the scouting run. Compound-specific method optimization has been successfully transferred from HPLC to SFC. Another algorithm, time on target, is another technique from HPLC. Time on target is the algorithm behind the gradient optimizer used in AccuPrep HPLC and SFC systems. People will often just guess as to the best solvent composition to use for a run. They make a guess from the scouting run, they will do a run and then improve the guess until they get a chromatogram that is good enough. Someone with a lot of experience can make a good guess, but they usually still need several runs, or they just use a method that is good enough, even if it isn't great. People new to chromatography need a lot of time and many trial runs to get a good result using this method. Compound-specific method optimization divides the scouting run into different zones. Many users have a chart like this near their prep system. Someone had to spend time putting this chart together. Although originally created for preparative HPLC, as shown in the first reference, it has been adapted for SFC as described in the other two references shown on this slide. Each zone in this chart represents a different method on the preparative SFC system. This is easy to run once it is set up, but the gradient isn't optimized for any single compound. If this compound at 6 minutes, or this compound at 8 minutes are the compound of interest, they will elute late in the determined gradient. And this compound at 10.5 minutes will elute early in the gradient. The generated gradient methods aren't optimized for any particular compound and will require further adjustment by the user. It takes a bit of time to determine the zones, and a change to either the analytical or prep system means a new chart needs to be made due to draw volume differences between the system. Ionizable compounds at the end of the zones may be problematic because they may not elute when expected in a determined gradient method. The time on target algorithm is used to calculate gradient methods on the AccuPrep SFC. It acts like an experienced chromatographer. The algorithm creates a gradient method where the compound is expected to elute at the center of the gradient curve, so there is much better chance of a successful calculated gradient that can be used with no further changes, which saves time and sample. With this algorithm, new users with no experience can get excellent results immediately without a long learning curve. The algorithm works by setting a desired retention time on the SFC using an isocratic run. Using the same co-solvent and a matching analytical column, the same sample is run with the scouting gradient. Whenever the compound used for calibration elutes in the scouting run, that retention time is defined as having the same solvent composition used in the isocratic run. We can then measure the apparent gradient delay. We apply that same apparent delay to any compound we run with that scouting gradient, and then determine a solvent composition that elutes the compound on the preparative column. The AccuPrep SFC has these calibrations saved in the system, and analytical SFC systems can be easily calibrated to the AccuPrep SFC. This is a scouting run from the section where column screening was discussed. This is thalidomide that was run on the CCA column. An isocratic method was calculated from the scouting run, and it gave good results on the very first trial. The internal scouting runs on the AccuPrep SFC have all of the calibrations done for you. The target column may be the same as the one used for the scouting run, or it may be a different column of the same chemistry. Running it on the AccuPrep SFC is useful if you have a preparative column with a unique chemistry and no matching analytical columns. One would just inject a small amount of sample for the scouting run. In this example, the peak at 5.8 minutes was chosen, which is the third eluting peak. We also made the analytical calibrations easy, so an analytical scouting run from most analytical SFC systems can be used to determine AccuPrep SFC focused gradients. Here is another example. Again, the isocratic method was determined from the scouting run on the first attempt. The scouting gradient can be run on the AccuPrep SFC if there are no matching analytical columns, as was done in this. After the isocratic method is created, It is easy to create stacked injections with sample overlays to reduce the number of fraction containers used. The time on target algorithm works for achiral compounds too. This example uses a peptide. It was pre-purified on a CombiFlash NextGen 300+. The peptide was eluted in about 30% methanol, showing that it is a rather polar compound. We will use the SFC to make the peptide even more pure. We will first do a column screen on the SFC. The solvent was methanol containing 50 millimole ammonia. It was ammoniated methanol that was diluted and was not ammonium hydroxide. Because carbon dioxide is being used, the silica won't dissolve even though ammonia is part of the mobile phase, as would happen with liquid chromatography. Of the columns tested, only the silica column in the lower right eluted the peptide. The scouting gradient was used to calculate a focused gradient on a silica column, and the peptide was easily run as a focused gradient. Natural products comprise a range of compounds ranging from non-polar carotenoids to polar alkaloids and phenols. They have all been purified with SFC. Polar compounds such as alkaloids and phenolic compounds comprise the majority of compounds successfully purified on SFC. This example allowed thiopylene to be purified using only methanol as the co-solvent. Xanthine alkaloids are commonly purified with dichloromethane in traditional liquid chromatography, but using SFC allows us to avoid the safety hazard of chlorinated solvents. Sometimes the determined gradient method doesn't work. Start with the simple things first. Make sure the instrument is running properly, both the analytical and prep. I often run a standard compound to make sure the system is running correctly and the pumps and heaters are working. Running a standard when using a series of injections also helps me to verify I'm using the correct solvent and column. Our Teledyne ISCO weblog describes using a checklist where we verify that we chose the correct column, solvent, additive, and even sample before starting a run. Sometimes columns wear out due to loss of bonded phase or irreversible adsorption of impurities. Analytical columns are used for more samples than the larger prep columns due to screening, and so may wear out faster. A symptom is that peaks elute consistently later than expected during preparative runs because compounds are retained less on the analytical scouting run, resulting in a calculated gradient that has too little co-solvent. Additives might be needed for good peak shape, although sometimes peak retention might be very different for ionizable compound when the gradient is adjusted for preparative runs. Ideally, the temperature and pressure settings should be the same between analytical and the preparative system. The density of supercritical carbon dioxide is controlled by temperature and pressure. Higher density causes early elution of compounds. Column memory effects can cause changes in retention. This isn't unique to supercritical fluid chromatography, as this has been observed for some HPLC columns as well. The bottom run labeled new column was the compound mixture run with ethyl acetate before the column was run with any other solvent. The column was fresh from the box. The column was run with methanol for other work. After repeating the original experiment with ethyl acetate co-solvent, significant changes in retention was observed. When the column was used again with methanol, these purifications for methanol were reproducible. The column was very good for methanol experiment. I only noticed this effect because I was purifying non-polar compounds and needed ethyl acetate. Many people only use alcohols, so they won't see such changes in their columns. The same scouting gradient was run with ethyl acetate in the first peak, showed considerable change in retention and peak shape. The retention was such that it moved between zone as the run was repeated and the column stabilized to running ethyl acetate again. Using scouting run number 1 to determine a gradient method for peak 1 would lead to late elution in the isocratic run. Some basic bonded phases will show a similar change when run with an acidic mobile phase. 5 to 8% water is sometimes used as an additive with memory effects on some columns. When in doubt, contact the column manufacturer. I'd like to thank you for your time today. You can follow us on social media. And now we can take questions. Well, everyone, thank you for your time. And the first question is, what do you do with columns that do change with solvents? Solvents such as ethyl acetate and 5% water and alcohol are unusual, so people only use them as they need to. If I need to run columns under such situation, I label them and so that I only use them with the special solvent in the future. Next question is, how does the back pressure of carbon dioxide in the analytical column, how does a difference in that affect your prep run? And the answer to that is, it depends on the density of the carbon dioxide. If the back pressure on your analytical system is higher, that means that the carbon dioxide is more dense and compounds can elute a little bit earlier. This means that when we calculate a gradient on the preparative system, we might see a little bit later elution. Does the column type affect the calibration? No, only the size of the column. The only change, and within the PeakTrack software, we adjust for the column size so that we can scale up or scale down as needed without additional calibrations. Does the column type affect the calibration? No, just answered that. Does the co-solvent affect the calibration? And the answer to that is no, it doesn't, because if the compound elutes earlier, we just calculate a lower gradient, and if it elutes later, we calculate a gradient with a higher co-solvent composition. Can I use the same column type from different manufacturers? In other words, I use a dial from one company and a dial from a different company on the analytical system. And the answer to that is there is usually a selectivity difference between the columns. So you might get away with it for some compounds, and other compounds will give you a bit of a surprise when they elute differently when you calculate the prep system.